What should I start by saying?
What do you mean?
What's up, YouTube? It's Big Ryan, the fat guy. Today we're going to talk about rookie running backs and are they being overvalued? Are they being undervalued? Or is it just right? Fat guy, let's start with Saquon Barkley. He's projected to be picked 8th overall this year in fantasy drafts.
I'm going to say Saquon how many more times? Undervalued, overvalued? I think he's just right. I mean, he is going to be the 8th overall pick. That's his average draft position, of course. And we're talking about running backs that are drafted. There are some undrafted players like Chris Warren that we're interested in, but today we're talking about drafted running backs. And Saquon was the first running back off the board, as many had envisioned. And obviously, it looked like he could do everything in college. But what's more important to me than so much as how good they were in college was the opportunity they're going to have. Now, with this coaching staff, I believe he's going to be given every opportunity to succeed. The only thing that kind of is worrisome is I feel like they have a lot of weapons in New York for once. Evan Ingram turned to be a fantasy-producing tight end. Of course, there's some negatives to some of his game, but as far as production, he was definitely high. Odell Beckham is coming back, and of course, Beckham, not my favorite receiver, but he's still one of the best in the game, and he will most certainly produce as long as he's healthy. And also Sterling Shepard, another guy who's going to be able to produce as long as he's healthy. And not to mention, Saquon doesn't have too much veteran presence behind him. They signed Jonathan Stewart from Carolina, who was a Dave Gettleman signing as the Giants, as they hired Dave Gettleman, former Carolina Panther GM, as their GM, and he brought along Jonathan Stewart. But reports from camp haven't been so good, and I'm not sure how much he has left in the tank. He kind of lost his job to Christian McCaffrey, oddly enough, and I'm not sure that he's going to snake away too many snaps from Saquon Barkley. The only other guy behind him is maybe Wayne Gallman. I'm just not sure these guys are really going to get too many snaps. So if Barkley is the feature of this offense along with Odell Beckham, not to mention Eli Manning isn't the Eli Manning of old. Not that he ever was the Eli Manning of old. He's not that good a quarterback, it feels, despite being a 2-time Super Bowl MVP. So they might be more run-centric. They've also beefed up their offensive line by adding Nate Solder from the Patriots, although I'm not sure how well that's going. They also drafted a mean guard in Will Hernandez in the 2nd round to beef up their offensive line. I mean, they have addressed it. So I feel like Saquon's just going to play like 80-90% of the snaps. And that would make it just right. Is the production level going to match that of an experienced back at that spot? I'm not sure. But I do think that this is, an okay gamble. I wouldn't take him 1st overall unless, of course, it was a keeper league.
So an interesting fact to throw in there is Ezekiel Elliott is the only other player since 2010 who's been drafted in the 1st round of fantasy leagues. He went about 9th in his year.
Other rookie.
The only other rookie since 2010. And he managed to average 18 fantasy points per game, which is awesome for that.
It's unbelievable. But you got to remember, that's a sample size of 1. I think that's maybe the ceiling of Saquon Barkley. But the basement, I bet you, is a little bit lower for Saquon.
Yeah, sure. It is a little bit of a risk, him being a rookie, him being a 1st overall pick. There's so many other sure things that you can get at the start, barring injury. But a lot of people know Saquon. Let's skip over Saquon, and I think people know what he's about. Let's go over to the 2nd pick in the draft, 27th overall. That's Seattle Seahawks running back RASHAAD Penny, who's been struggling with some injuries. Right now, his ADP is 78th overall. Fat guy, where would you put him?
Immensely overvalued. I'm not sure how much he's even going to be on the field. I mean, he's one of those guys where I feel if he plays a lot, it'll be because they drafted him high. I think Chris Carson is a better back. I mean, he got all these yards at, San Diego State? Well, so did Donnell Pumphrey. Donnell Pumphrey has the most yards, I believe, in collegiate history, and he's someone who's going to struggle to make a roster as he's like 5th string on the Eagles. It's going to be difficult for Penny to make a big impact, especially when you look at how bad the Seattle Seahawks offensive line is. 90% of Seattle's production, I believe, came from Russell Wilson, and I don't know how much that could change this year. Aside from, the only other guy I'm excited about on offense is really Chris Carson. Now, Chris Carson, he was off to a pretty good start last year, and then he got injured. All the reports from camp are that he's doing quite well, and he's relishing in that role as a starting running back. I don't think RASHAAD Penny is going to outsnap him. I don't think RASHAAD Penny is going to play that much. If I were the coach and trying to win football games, of course. I think Chris Carson's a real deal. I think that's the guy you want. And somehow he's going a lot later than RASHAAD Penny is. Probably because of that rookie hype.
Yeah, Chris Carson played so well last year in his limited time. The injury doesn't help coming back from injury, but Penny's already injured. He's missing snaps during the preseason. He's missing practice. It's not good for a rookie.
Well, the one good thing, though, for him, I guess, is that he's only battling Chris Carson. If there is an injury, there's no doubt to me that he'll be the feature back, but I still don't think he's as polished as a lot of the other rookie running backs, as well as the guy listed ahead of them on their own roster, Chris Carson. So I think Chris Carson's the guy to have in Seattle, and I would pass on Rashad Penny.
And next up, we have New England Patriots running back SONY MICHEL. He was a first-round pick, 31st overall from the Patriots this year, from Georgia, the SEC. SONY MICHEL is currently going 72nd overall in fantasy drafts. Fat Guy, what do you think about SONY MICHEL?
I think he's a really good player. He split time at Georgia with Nick Chubb, and I think he took over the role a little bit while Nick Chubb was injured. SONY MICHEL is definitely a good player, exciting to watch. I just don't like I think he's overvalued as far as average draft position goes. The Patriots like to have a running back carousel, more or less. If you look at their numbers from last year, Dion Lewis got the most yards, but it wasn't staggering or anything, and I don't think SONY MICHEL can necessarily walk in and be Dion Lewis. Dion Lewis took many, many years to become the player he is, and SONY MICHEL might not take as steep of a curve, but it will take him some time to adjust, and he's missed a lot of training camp. And missing a lot of training camp for the New England Patriots makes it less likely that you're going to get on the field, because there's so many nuances about being a football player rather than just playing your position to get on the field. That's why guys like Rex Burkhead and Mike Gillislee get contract offers, is because they kind of know the drill about being a professional, and they know the ins and outs as far as being on the field that have less to do with their position and more to do with football awareness, let's say. So missing that kind of time is definitely going to impact his playing time. Not to mention guys like James White, who are kind of entrenched in their position. James White is, I guess, a consummate professional receiving back. He's never been one of my favorite players. However, though, he does put up reasonable receiving numbers. And as far as first and second down running backs, there's kind of a bit of a dogfight. I mean, Rex Burkhead's going to get it some of the time. I'm not sure Mike Gillislee's going to make the team. But Jeremy Hill out of Cincinnati that they acquired, he looked pretty decent in the preseason himself, and there's a chance that he could be running a lot of that. So SONY MICHEL has some stiff competition. I'm not sure how many snaps he can take away from Hill or Burkhead, and I'm not sure how many snaps he can take away from James White. So it might take a year or two for him to assimilate hard into his role with New England Patriots. That's why drafting him high would be a bit of a risk. In dynasty formats, drafting him here I'd be totally fine with. But as far as a one-and-done year like this year, I think he'd be someone to avoid.
A guy you mentioned in there who is quite interesting is Jeremy Hill. When you look at rookie running backs over the last 7 years, Jeremy Hill was actually 7th all-time in points for. He put up 12 points a game in his rookie season, 1,300 yards, 9 touchdowns, 188 total fantasy points. I'm not saying he's going to replicate that at all, but he does have the chance to pick up touchdowns, pick up yards on those early downs. There might be a game where he gets 30 carries.
It's possible. I mean, that's happened. If you look at the Patriots, how they've handled their running backs in the last few years. I mean, LeGarrette Blount got 18 touchdowns, what was it, 2 years ago? I mean, all of this stuff is in the realm of possibilities. And now Jeremy Hill has done this before. Again, I'm not saying that this is the year, but I'd much rather take a flyer later on Jeremy Hill than have to sacrifice an early pick on an unknown role in SONY MICHEL. Not that I don't think SONY MICHEL isn't a great player.
And SONY MICHEL is a great player. He's going to develop into a good running back for the New England Patriots. If I had to pick a guy this year, it would be James White. He was a receiving back that you and I didn't like. You in particular, you told me he was trash the first time you saw him play. I kind of agreed as I kind of went along, but similar to a guy like Chris Thompson, who's really grown on us, they've developed into really, really good players. It takes longer for a receiving type back. I picture SONY MICHEL as more of a receiving back than an every down back, and I think it's going to take him a year or two, maybe even longer. It might not even happen for him to develop into a good player.
It's really difficult. Like I said, he could become like a Dion Lewis or perhaps better, but that takes some time. That's why I would just avoid him this year, and I'd stick with Jeremy Hill, and then next in value I'd probably go James White. Those are the two guys that I think have decent chances at roles this year. That being said, there is a chance Jeremy Hill might not make the team, oddly enough.
And next up, we have his ex-teammate from Georgia. That's Nick Chubb, who was drafted early in the second round, 35th overall by the Cleveland Browns. Nick Chubb was my favorite running back coming into the NFL. I was very excited as a Cleveland Browns fan, drafting Chubb, super excited. And Nick Chubb, 124th overall ADP. Fat Guy, is he overvalued, undervalued, or is this just right for him?
I think he's overvalued. I think it's going to be tough for him to get snaps. I almost think it has to be an injury. He has Carlos Hyde ahead of him on the early downs, and Duke Johnson, I think, is the most firmly entrenched as the third down running back. I mean, I think there's times where you get Hyde and Johnson, or perhaps Chubb and Johnson on the field. But Chubb, like you said, hasn't looked so good so far in training camp and the preseason. And I think it's going to be very difficult for him to usurp Carlos Hyde or Duke Johnson, preferably Carlos Hyde, in any of their roles. I'll give him this. There isn't that much depth behind him. There's that 7th round pick from last year, Matt Days. I really wouldn't worry about him making noise. But Chubb was such an explosive player at Georgia before his injury, and he still wasn't bad after. I mean, he did split time with SONY MICHEL. They were a pretty decent duo. But I don't see that being the case with him and Hyde or him and Johnson. I think Hyde and Johnson are stuck in their roles, and it'll be difficult for Chubb to get a lot of playing time this year. I think next year would be a better plan for it.
Yeah, and going into the season, I'd argue that Hyde and Chubb, there's not too much of a difference, but being on the field, playing NFL snaps, you can see the talent difference between Hyde over Chubb right now. Next on, let's move over to Ronald Jones II. Ronald Jones was the 38th pick overall in the second round to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. He played in USC, and right now his ADP is 85th overall. Fat guy. I'm just going to jump out and say it. He is overvalued.
I think he's way overvalued. Now, one of the things that's interesting with Ronald Jones is he had very few catches in college. What was it, like 16 or something like that?
I think it was 17 receptions all throughout college.
Yeah, don't burn our heads for this one, but it's somewhere very low. We can all agree on that. All the training camp news about him has been fairly negative, but a lot of it has to do with him not being an all-around player. Like you mentioned earlier about Carlos Hyde, playing NFL snaps and being at NFL camps is very meaningful, and it's difficult to thrust yourself right in there. Not to mention things like pass blocking, I mean even run blocking in some cases for some of the running backs. I mean, it'd have to be a specific set, but it is a probability. But pass blocking is a big issue, and I'm not sure Ronald Jones can catch and he can pass block necessarily. Peyton Barber has been in the system. He understands what's expected of him. He understands what is expected of being a professional. So I'd imagine that Peyton Barber is the one who's going to get the most looks. I think he's very undervalued. I think Ronald Jones is overvalued because of his notoriety at USC.
And just to touch, Peyton Barber is going 122nd overall. Compare that to Ronald Jones, who's going 85th, and even a guy like Nick Chubb, who we just talked about, pretty much going right where Peyton Barber is. Peyton Barber is going to be a starter day one, whereas Chubb has to fight off two other guys. Barber is so much further ahead of Ronald Jones. By the time you're drafting, it might be too late. Barber might have already replaced Jones, and they might have flipped spots. But as of now, at 122, Peyton Barber is an excellent value running back to have. The guy's going to start, he's going to play snaps, and he's going to be relatively productive for a team that needs a running back to be successful.
Peyton Barber is also heavy, so you can expect goal line touches as well. So you should see a little bit of a touchdown blip for Peyton Barber. Now, there is one thing we're all forgetting. This is still the Buccaneers, and this is still Peyton Barber. They're not going to blow you away. They're not amazing or anything. I just think there's too much preseason hype about a lot of the rookies, and one of them being Ronald Jones, a player who I particularly liked his college tape. That doesn't mean that his fit's right, like I mentioned. Fit has so much more to do with fantasy than the player itself, and I think the fit for Ronald Jones is difficult in that they're in a basement dweller team like the Buccaneers, who we do think are going to have a resurgence, but they don't exactly have an awesome offensive line. There's some trouble at quarterback. I think it's going to be hard for the Buccaneers backfield to drum up a lot of points, and if they are going to drum up points, I think the first guy with a crack at it really is Peyton Barber. So I'm going to say for Ronald Jones, it is overvalued. The guy you want would be Peyton Barber.
Next up, second round pick, 43rd overall to the Detroit Lions is Kerryon Johnson, a running back from Auburn. Right now, he's going 67th overall ADP in fantasy football drafts. Fat guy, what do you think about Kerryon Johnson? Is he overvalued, undervalued, or is he just right?
This is the hardest one of all. We kind of toss and turn on this a bit. I think he's just right, but when you look at the competition on the Detroit Lions, it's pretty difficult. Theo Riddick, LeGarrette Blount, Amir Abdullah, Zach Zinner, Dwayne Washington. I mean, those are all guys who have played in the league. So it's difficult to kind of get above them. There is one thing, though, is none of those guys had success except the newly acquired LeGarrette Blount. Now, LeGarrette Blount might be a coach's favorite. As they have a new coach, in Matt Patricia. So they're going to have a little bit of a different identity probably on offense and defense. So there might be some more opportunities for Detroit to finally lock up that one-game 100-yard rusher that they haven't had in so long. The guy that very well could break it would be Kerryon Johnson if I were to guess. Kerryon Johnson kind of is an all-around player, but like I said, there is so much competition, but I think he will get opportunities to get first crack at it. He really is a complete back, I feel, in a decent situation, on a decent team. Guys like LeGarrette Blount, I would worry about him vulturing some touchdowns, but I think Johnson is just right at his ADP at, was it 67?
He's 67th overall right now, ADP.
Yeah, if it drops any lower, I would say that he would be overvalued, but if he somehow slides back 10 or 15 picks, then I would say that he's undervalued. Right where he is, I think, is right in the meat of it.
I still think he's just slightly overvalued. Like you just said, there's so much competition there. The one thing I'm unsure of is the coaching staff and what they're going to do on offense, because this has been just a throw-heavy team every year until this new coaching addition, and I'm not sure what they're going to do. You hopefully think that they're going to make some changes because they've been successful, but not playoff successful with Matthew Stafford.
Well, knowing the Patriots' pedigree that comes with Matt Patricia, I'd imagine it would be more balanced. And can I think of a guy that's more balanced in the backfield than Kerryon Johnson? That's why I feel he is where he is for a reason.
That's true. If they do go pass heavy, though, I'm still leaning towards Theo Riddick, because Theo Riddick is one of the better pass-catching backs in the league. Not saying that Kerryon Johnson can't do it, just Theo Riddick is so polished. But if they're going to go to a more run-heavy style, I do like Kerryon Johnson. That's where you could see a guy like LeGarrette Blount eat into those snaps or eat into touchdown-type opportunities. But Kerryon does look good. He does look better than a lot of the other rookie running backs that we have talked about so far. Next up, we'll do a very, very quick piece on DERRIUS GUICE. He was the second round, 59th pick overall for the Redskins. He's gone out. He's done for the year with an injury. Fat guy, any thoughts on him? I know he's not fantasy relevant, but maybe next year?
Yeah, I mean, maybe next year. You never know after you've had an ACL injury. I'm not sure how good he'd be this year, but I will jump in and say it's a really cloudy situation. Running backs are to be avoided in Washington.
Chris Thompson is the best running back they have by far. I think this move for picking up Adrian Peterson is actually a little bit of a kudos to DERRIUS GUICE, because if GUICE was there, there's no way they'd be bringing in Peterson, and it just shows you how much further ahead GUICE is than Rob Kelly and Samaj P. Ryan. That is right. One of our darlings from last year. Fat guy, do you want to mention, I know that this is something we've talked about off the mic, Chris Thompson's value actually improves by bringing in Adrian Peterson. Do you want to explain?
Chris Thompson's value does improve by bringing in Adrian Peterson, because Peterson is such a polarizing back. He really is a non-factor for the most part in the pass game, but he's such a bruising player when he runs in between the tackles, as well as outside too. But that means that Chris Thompson's role is more defined. Not that it wasn't already. Chris Thompson really is going to play a lot of meaningful snaps, and Chris Thompson paired with Alex Smith could be really troublesome for opposing defenses. Chris Thompson is definitely the guy to own.
All right, fat guy. Up next is Royce Freeman, the third-round pick, 71st overall from the Denver Broncos. He played for Oregon in college. His ADP going into the season is 45th overall. That's quite high for a player of his stature. Is Royce Freeman overvalued, undervalued, or is he just right at 45th overall?
I think he's overvalued. 45 is it's pretty high. Do I think he's in the same conversation as some of the guys you've mentioned? Not really. I mean, and you're also playing for the Denver Broncos. The Denver Broncos, I think they're going to be a nightmare on offense. I think they're going to be a poorly coached team. They don't have a strong offensive line. They're kind of weak in every area, it feels like, on offense. They've added Case Keenum, which should help them a little bit, but it's not going to be able to put them over the top. They're going to be poor on offense. They're going to have a difficult season. I think it's going to be tough for Royce Freeman to leave his mark with such a poor offensive line in front of him and a lack of awareness on coaching.
The problem I have with the Broncos is they just have such a muddled backfield with players like Devontae Booker Even a receiving back like Phillip Lindsay, who showed well so far in the preseason. A guy who showed well last year in the preseason, D'Angelo Henderson. But I'm just not sure who's going to carve out a role in what, and if it's even going to matter on this Broncos team. Next up is Nyheim Hines, the 4th round pick, 104th overall from the Indianapolis Colts. He played in NC State, and currently, Fat Guy, his ADP is 170th overall. Is he overvalued, undervalued, or just right?
I think Nyheim Hines is overvalued. He's already fumbled the ball 4 times in preseason, and that's enough not to play. And we were just earlier talking about the Broncos, who definitely have a cloudy backfield. I think the Indianapolis Colts have one too, but they do have a front runner, I believe, in Marlon Mack, which will make it more difficult for Nyheim Hines to get on the field. I mean, they do play certain different types of roles, and Nyheim Hines is kind of a jitterbug, a speedy scat back, so to speak. But if you fumble the ball and you're light, it's going to be difficult for you to have the coach's trust to get you on the field. And I feel like the direction that they're headed in, the Indianapolis Colts, it's going to be hard for Nyheim Hines to get meaningful touches. When you fumble 4 times, the chance of you getting on the field has dwindled drastically. And with other players in the backfield, such as Robert Turbin, who is suspended but could come back, like I mentioned, Marlon Mack, and also rookie Jordan Wilkins, who we're going to talk about in just the near future, as well as a veteran in Brandon Oliver and perennial preseason standout who never seems to make a fantasy impact, Christine Michael. I actually think Nyheim Hines, out of everyone I mentioned, might be the least fantasy relevant because of his ball security and coaching trust issues.
Next up is 4th round pick, 112th overall from the Cincinnati Bengals, Mark Walton, who played in Miami, Florida. He is currently 313th overall ADP-wise, so essentially he's not being drafted. Fat Guy, over, under, or is this just right?
Overvalued, undervalued, or just right? Well, when you're undrafted and you're probably not going to play, I'm going to have to go with just right, along with a couple of guys that are going to follow him. Just right is probably right for Mark Walton. He's firmly behind Joe Mixon as well as Giovanni Bernard. It'd be really difficult for him to see the field. There is a chance he could be a waiver pickup guy at some juncture in the season, but currently he's undrafted, and that's where I believe he should be.
Yeah, you really need an injury to one of those two guys. Joe Mixon just has so much talent, and Giovanni Bernard is also a really good running back, an experienced running back that's going to be playing on passing downs if Joe Mixon isn't carrying the load. Obviously, Mark Walton isn't a guy you're going to draft, but keep your eye out. If one of those two players gets hurt, Mark Walton is your guy to keep your eye on. Next up is 4th round pick, 126 overall from the Atlanta Falcons, is Ito Smith, the small running back out of Southern Miss. His ADP is 395th overall. What do you think about this rookie? Overvalued, undervalued, or is Ito Smith just right?
Well, like I mentioned before about Mark Walton, Ito Smith suffers the same fate in being just right as undrafted. I mean, this could be a guy that you pick up in the waiver if an injury were to arise. How could he steal meaningful snaps from Devonta Freeman or Tevin Coleman? I just don't see it. It would be really difficult for it to happen. I mean, they might carve out some specialty roles, and there might be certain situations where he will get snaps, but the bulk of the carries are going to be Devonta Freeman and Tevin Coleman, and it's going to be difficult for Ito Smith to make an impact barring an injury.
Yeah, the talent, it's just like the last two, even more so for Atlanta, as the talent is so high with those two running backs. It's going to be hard for Ito Smith to get snaps other than gimmicky type snaps like a reverse here or a trick play there. Maybe a special teams play, but otherwise there's not much there for him. Let's move on to another 4th round pick, 131st overall. The Miami Dolphins drafted KALEN BALLAGE from Arizona State. And I know he's a guy that you're interested in. His ADP is 225th overall. Overvalued, undervalued, or just right?
I think it's just right. Now, a lot of people are going to, scream for my head and want to put it onto the end of a pike and parade it around the town square. But KALEN BALLAGE, despite having excellent tape, I think his average draft position at 225 is just right. I actually think Frank Gore and Kenyon Drake are going to get a lot of carries, and I think Frank Gore is going to get surprisingly a lot of carries. Frank Gore is a consummate professional, probably a Hall of Famer in the future. He's still got a little bit of juice in the tank, and I feel like they're going to drain it before they hand over a lot of the responsibilities to rookie incumbent Kalen Ballage. Now, Kalen Ballage's tape I really enjoyed. I think he's got a lot of strengths, and I think he's got a bright future ahead of him if he's able to mind his P's and Q's and really pick up on some, really advance his football awareness, let's say. I mean, he had some fumbling issues, I believe, in the preseason already. That's where a lot of the coaches, they pull their hair out, like I mentioned, with NYHEIM HINES. And I'm not sure the coaching staff is going to trust Kalen Ballage off the get-go, but he's another guy that would be a huge waiver target for me at some point. I mean, if Miami starts to not do well, there's reason for them to take the next step and at least get a good look at their rookies and give them a little bit more snaps. So he might want to be one of those guys that you want to gamble on earlier than later if you need to fill out your roster on the waiver wire. I think he's firmly entrenched in third spot for this Miami Dolphins team, who again is not exactly a team that's an offensive powerhouse. However, though, with things that could go from bad to worse in Miami, Kalen Ballage might be one of those guys you might want to jump on the waiver wire early if that does happen early on in the season.
Let's move on to the final 4th round pick of the 2018 NFL Draft. For running backs, 134th overall to the Arizona Cardinals is Chase Edmonds from Fordham. He is currently going 251st overall ADP-wise. Fat guy, overvalued, undervalued, or just right for Chase Edmonds?
I'm going to have to go with just right. I mean, David Johnson is just... he's just unbelievable. I mean, he plays so many snaps for the Cardinals for a reason. One of the reasons I like him so much this year is because I think the Cardinals are particularly bad, especially if you watch our Cardinals video, which we'll link in the description below. Now, if they're really bad and they're always losing, you're going to be passing a lot. Now, what back other than LeVeon Bell would be best to play in a passing role when you're losing? David Johnson. The only thing I'm worried about David Johnson is he picks up a niggling injury, kind of like that stupid wrist sprain he got last year, where they shut him down for the rest of the year. Now, there could have been more to that, but they certainly didn't let the public know. He didn't play last year, and he went down very easily after, I believe, the first or second game. Was it first game?
It was the first game.
It was the first game, so everyone who had him in fantasy definitely didn't perform well after losing their first pick.
You don't have to tell me twice.
So that being said, with David Johnson playing so many expected snaps, I believe that Chase Edmonds' chances of getting on the field are very, very low, much like the other guys that have been mentioned just before this. With that in mind, I think that Chase Edmonds would be another guy that you look on the waiver wire. If David Johnson picks up any sort of injury, I would consider getting Chase Edmonds. If there's any report of David Johnson even getting a day-to-day injury, I would pick up Chase Edmonds. He's another guy that you're going to want to have your finger on the trigger really quickly as far as the waiver goes.
Yeah, if you're drafting David Johnson in the first 3-4 picks, you probably want to pick up Chase Edmonds as a handcuff, just because last year he should have been playing. He sprains his wrist, like Fat Guy said. Maybe there's more to the story than they told us, but you have to be worried about injuries with David Johnson. He's going to play so much. He's going to carry the rock so much. He's going to have so many receptions that he's just likely to get hurt. And it seems like Chase Edmonds is the guy to have. I'm looking at their roster right now, and it's pretty thin with players that aren't exactly great talent-wise. So Chase Edmonds looks like the obvious handcuff to have. Fat Guy, let's move on to Jordan Wilkins, the 5th-round pick, 169th overall by the Indianapolis Colts. Played for Ole Miss. Right now, his ADP is 172nd overall. Is Jordan Wilkins overvalued, undervalued, or just right?
Now, I really like players out of Ole Miss. I think Jordan Wilkins, I think he's undervalued, actually. Now, we did talk about the Colts earlier at some reasonable length when we were speaking of NYHEIM HINES and his fumbling woes, and we did mention that they do have, not necessarily depth, but they do have a lot of bodies on their roster. Now, one of those bodies is Jordan Wilkins. And now, like I said, Christine Michael's always a preseason star, but a regular season bust. I think Jordan Wilkins is going to be able to elevate him above the likes of Josh Ferguson, Christine Michael, and Brandon Oliver, a former LA Charger, well, then San Diego Charger. And I think he's going to play a little bit behind Marlon Mack, who was a rookie last year. Now, Marlon Mack's also picked up an injury that might sideline him till the first week. I do think there's a chance that some snaps are going to head in the way of Jordan Wilkins. And this is one of your last picks, so it's not like you're taking a big risk on Jordan Wilkins. But when it comes to the two between him and NYHEIM HINES, who are both rookies, I think he's definitely got a lead on NYHEIM HINES, as he hasn't fumbled yet, especially not 4 times. So Jordan Wilkins, I think, is a guy to look, especially if you're in a keeper league where there's a really deep draft. It'd be best to get a grip on someone like that in the later rounds.
I'm going to play devil's advocate and say that Marlon Mack is pretty strongly entrenched as the number 1 back in Indianapolis. With Robert Turbin being suspended, he's a little bit in jeopardy. But if Robert Turbin comes back, I still think that he's ahead of Jordan Wilkins. But that's just my personal opinion. Fat Guy, you might disagree with me.
Yes, I do, clearly.
Just double checking. But I would prefer to have Robert Turbin over Jordan Wilkins. But Jordan Wilkins is definitely the guy to have over NYHEIM Hines. Next up is 6th round pick for the Los Angeles Rams, 176 overall. Running back John Kelly, whose current ADP is 270th overall in fantasy drafts. Fat Guy, overvalued, undervalued, just right for running back John Kelly from the LA Rams.
I'm going to play the same song and say just right, because anyone behind Todd Gurley is not going to get very many snaps. And this is going to be, I'd imagine, for the same in rookie John Kelly. Of course, this is barring any injury. If there is an injury to Todd Gurley, I wouldn't mind picking him up and taking a chance on him. But barring that, he's definitely not on my draft board. I mean, there are going to be situations probably where he's going to get some looks from Coach McVay, and perhaps if they're up in a game, they will get a good look at their rookie. These are a lot of hopeful circumstances. So hope and luck are terrible strategies. So your best bet is to lay off and not draft John Kelly.
Yeah, you're definitely not drafting John Kelly. And if Todd Gurley goes down, to me, the handcuff to have is Malcolm Brown. He has been an experienced back, an experienced guy who got to play there last year under McVay. If Gurley goes down, Malcolm Brown's the handcuff to have. Next up, we have 6th round pick, 201st overall, New Orleans Saint running back Boston Scott from Louisiana Tech. Fat Guy, he's 399th overall ADP. I'll just skip you guys. The rest of these guys are essentially not being drafted. Let's go over quickly Boston Scott, New Orleans Saints.
He is just right at his undrafted ADP. He's behind Alvin Kamara. He's behind Mark Ingram, who is suspended. He's probably not going to get a look. I mean, I'd be really impressed if he did to usurp two guys like that, two Pro Bowl caliber players. So it is just right. Stay away.
Yeah, even with Ingram being suspended, Boston Scott still won't play, so it's a guy you want to stay away from. Next up, 6th round pick, New York Jets, 204th overall, Trenton Cannon from Virginia State. He's not even listed on this ADP list that I'm checking out, and there's 400 plus players on here. Fat Guy, overvalued, undervalued, just right.
Just right. There are plenty of bodies ahead of him.
Yeah, especially Bilal Powell, Isaiah Crowell. Those are two very good backs. It's going to be hard for Trenton Cannon to play. 7th round, 226 overall, Denver Broncos running back David Williams from Arkansas. He's also not listed, also does not have an ADP. Any thoughts? Over, under, just right?
Just right at not being drafted. I did speak of the Denver Broncos backfield with disdain, and it doesn't change here. I mean, he is a bruiser. I mean, there's a chance he could get goal line snaps. He is a heavier back as far as their backfield is concerned. I mean, there's also another star in training camp that's probably ahead of him, but a different role altogether in undrafted free agent Phillip Lindsay out of Colorado or Colorado State. Regardless, this is a backfield to avoid for the most part, and that's a no draft on David Williams.
Second last is 7th round pick, 236 overall to the Dallas Cowboys, Bo Scarborough from Alabama, a guy that we kind of liked. His ADP is 311th overall. Overvalued, undervalued, just right.
It's just right. You shouldn't draft him. Although, if you're in a very deep league with lots of keepers where some of the options are limited at running back, there is some consideration for your last pick to saving it for Bo Scarborough. I mean, if it were me, he might get some of the goal line carries, or they might play two back sets with him in there as well. I mean, these are really, really thin situation. Bo Scarborough was a running back, a bruising running back for Alabama, but he has no Derrick Henry. He was a later pick for a reason. I do like him personally as a player, and he's one of the bigger names on the list, especially at the tail end, but he is undraftable as far as fantasy is concerned, unless it's a very unique situation in a very unique league.
And for me, Ezekiel Elliott is obviously the guy to have, but the obvious handcuff to me is Rod Smith.
Rod Smith, for sure.
He's a guy that's going to be able to step in and play a role very similar to Elliott. I believe it's a handcuff worth keeping your eye on, just similar to David Johnson.
Well, how similar could anyone's role be to Elliott, especially if you're a backup?
I still think he can be productive enough to be fantasy relevant, and a guy that plays enough snaps. And last up, 7th round pick, 251st overall, Los Angeles Chargers running back Justin Jackson from Northwestern. Fat Guy, his ADP is 336 overall. Overvalued, undervalued, just right.
Just right. He's not going to see the field either. He's been injured through camp. I don't believe he has any carries in the preseason. They have an undrafted free agent named Detrez Newsome, who's probably ahead of him. But again, we're talking about like depth running backs. Melvin Gordon and Austin Eckler are going to play a lot. It will take an injury for them to lose any sort of meaningful snaps.
That's it. Fat guy, is there anything else that you want to add to this running back discussion?
Generally avoid rookie running backs this year, in my opinion.
And it's funny that we say that because coming into this year, it is a very skilled group at running back. But fantasy-wise, there just isn't a lot of great options, especially with the ADPs and where people are set.
Well, the market's just too expensive, you know? And when everyone zigs, you zag. At least that's how I operate. Contrarian theory, I feel it works best in any sort of futures predicting market. And much like fantasy, running backs, as far as rookies go, are generally overvalued. So my opinion, if it comes down to a rookie versus a seasoned guy, take the seasoned guy. Don't think of upside as being super high. Take the steady Eddie, and you'll probably be better off.
If you've listened this far in, thanks for watching. Engage with us. Hit that like button if you like what we're saying. Hit the dislike button if you think we're shit and we need to improve. Give us a comment below with who you think is a surprise running back that could surprise this year, or who's overvalued, or who's undervalued, who's about just right. Focus on guys that you know, guys that you are watching, because Fat Guy and I, we look at this league from a bird's eye view. We love to hear your point of view. You know, as a Raiders fan, we want to hear what you think about Chris Warren.
We'd like to hear stories from camp, and if there's any breakout undrafted free agent, because those are the hardest to find news on.
If you look in the description box below, I'm going to send you guys a link. We've done a series for every team. We highlight the over-under for win totals. The Fat Guy and I put a ton of work in. There's been a ton of years that have gone into predicting games, predicting season win totals. Subscribe, and thanks for watching.
There's no way you need to improve, Big Rye.